Once upon a time, a reading platform was created and stories came to life. Readers reported fearsome dragons in flight, monsters emerging from the depths, and mysterious spirits entering our world. Campfire is where you can enjoy your favorite genre fiction through an interactive reading experience right here in your web browser. Discover new reads and unlock exclusive bonus content like short stories, world lore, and character profiles as you progress through each book. You will explore faraway worlds, swoon over star-crossed lovers, and embark on epic quests, all waiting for you just beyond the page. Save stories to your bookshelf with custom collections and join a community where you'll support the authors with higher royalties than anywhere else. Create your free account and choose the genres you like to read, then cozy up with a new book. Campfire is where the stories come to life.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first panel for our Wednesday of TBRCon 2025. I am really excited to be here with some amazing authors, and I'm really excited to talk about how science has caught up to what was once sci-fi. And so we're going to have some fun talking about that subject. But I wanted to start by letting everybody introduce themselves. And so I think we're just going to start next to me here with Sue Burke, and then we'll just kind of work our way through everyone else. So, Sue, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Sue Burke. I like to write science fiction, although I like to read pretty much everything. And I'm probably best known for my Semiosis series, which is a trilogy. The last book just came out, Semiosis, Interference, and Usurpation. And it's about plants that are intelligent. And then there's problems.
Love it. Thank you. All right, Wick.
My name's Wick Welker. I've been writing books for about 10 years, mostly sci-fi, almost entirely sci-fi. And I like to mix medicine and post-apocalyptic and some zombie stuff. And I just love writing. I just cannot not write. I'm always doing something on the side and just happy to be here.
Awesome. Thank you. Mary Robinette.
Hi, I'm Mary Robinette Kowal. I write science fiction and fantasy. I'm probably best known for my Lady Astronaut Universe, book 4 of which, The Martian Contingency, comes out March 18th.
Awesome. Great. Malka.
Hi, I'm Malka Older. I write, mostly science fiction. I wrote the Infomocracy series, and I'm now on the Massa and Pleiades series, which is murder mysteries set on Jupiter. And as a sociologist, I have done some research on risk and technology. So I think about tech in that way too.
Awesome. That's great. On Jupiter. I didn't realize that your book was set in Jupiter. I'm curious how that works with the atmosphere and everything, but
we all.
Love it. All right. I just want to start with kind of a fun question. So what sci-fi, sorry, I have questions off to the side, those watching, you're wondering why I'm looking over here. So what sci-fi did you grow up reading, and what technologies in those books made you excited about the sci-fi genre? So I would love to hear from y'all about that. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Neil Williams. I'm known as Neil the Book Guy on my different social platforms. I am also a book reviewer for FanFiAddict, and who are the ones who host this conference. And so I'm also one of the judges for the self-published science fiction contest this year. And so my team is working through our current selection of books right now, and it's been a blast so far. But that's enough about me. Back to the question. That gave y'all time to think about it if you weren't ready yet. So, all right. Who would like to go first? Does anybody have something jumping in their head they just want to talk about?
Well, I can start. The golden age of to read science fiction is supposedly around 12. And at that point, I was in junior high school, and I was working my way through the science fiction section in my junior high school. Which is pretty good. And I was reading Arthur C. Clarke and Asimov and Bradbury, and looking back, they had done a really good job of picking out good books. But okay, so my mom told me there was a TV show that was really good. And even though I was like 11, 12, I knew there was no good science fiction on TV, which was true at the time. But Mom, you got to humor her. So I watched the show. It was Star Trek, the original series. And I've been watching it ever since. So we all were. But you got to remember, at the time, the science of the time, when I was 7, John Glenn made his first orbit of the United States. And so I've got this button. It's really cool. It is one of the original. There's a joke that the guys at NASA thought that, okay, he's getting out of his capsule. No one really knew what was going on. It's hard to remember how very uncertain we were about how space works, what was going to happen. And they thought it would be funny if they all dressed up in gorilla costumes and wore this button. And then they decided he might have a heart attack and that would be bad, so they didn't. But anyway, so when I was 12 years old, Apollo 1, the rehearsal for that killed all the astronauts. It's hard to remember now how famous John Glenn was. Got a ticker tape parade. These guys were heroes. They were going out into the unknown. There was those Russians, but we didn't talk about them, except that we did. And then there was Star Trek, and they were out in space and having these adventures, and it was just heroic. Well, what's happened since then? Well, a lot. But what's happened in science fiction? We're still telling heroic stories. I mean, all of the panelists, you're doing that about wonderful things happening in space and lady astronauts. So I think science fiction has always been ahead of science in that and possibly other stuff.
So I echo some of what Sue is saying, that science fiction, I think, is linked to what's happening in science. That we tend to have kind of a zeitgeist thing where there will be a new scientific discovery, and all of the science fiction writers are like, "Oh, I can write a story about that." So the Voyager flyby was of Mars was one of the things that gave us Martian contingency. I think I have that slightly off, but you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah,
There's there are these things where we get a little bit of information and then we run with it. I was 12 in 1981. And so for me, the big thing was we got our first personal computer. My dad worked for IBM, so we got one of the very, very first early computers. And at the time when you were reading science fiction, computers and robots, they existed, but not necessarily the way we imagine them now. The stuff that I was reading, I was reading a lot of Anne McCaffrey, The Ship Who Sang, lots of Andre Norton. One of my favorite films / novelizations was The Cat from Outer Space, which came out in 1978. And now where I am, I'm talking to you on this thing that was a piece of science fiction when I was a kid. And my cat uses buttons to talk. And so I'm living the science fiction world that existed back then. It was the year of the first shuttle flight. There's a lot of stuff that happened. I have now written science fiction that has stopped being science fiction over the course of my career. Because, which is pretty cool. Yeah. And it's exciting to see how those changes happen.
It makes me wonder how much influence science fiction has had on the development of science in general. Is it is the ideas that children, grow up reading in books like yours and Sue's, or anybody's, are they the catalyst that drive the development? Shards of Earth did not like that comment.
I talked to a guy at JPL, and he started out reading science fiction as a kid, and that's why he was at JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory.
Yeah.
The flip phone, they have talked about being directly influenced by the Star Trek communicator. I'd love to hear from Wick and Malka.
I was too. I was about to ask them too. Yeah.
Thanks. I'm just going to say, as we're talking about which comes first, I just wrote an essay for a new edition that's about to come out of the Jules Verne From the Earth to the Moon, which it came out in 1865 and was not by any means the first story of flying to the moon. And it's really quite a story because he basically comes from the idea that these guys who did armaments and cannons during the Civil War got bored afterwards and felt like they had no purpose, and so they decided they were going to build a huge cannon to send a capsule to the moon. And that's sort of like, he's got this whole weird way of coming around to it, but he almost takes for granted the fact that we want to explore and that we want to do things that have never been done before. He almost doesn't even have to say this is why they're doing it, because he just comes at it as, yes, obviously we're going to go out and colonize stuff. It's an interesting book to read from our perspective. And he gets a lot of the science right too. He was very into the idea of writing these books almost as a curriculum for kids in a France that at the time had gone through a bunch of regime changes and a bunch of different ways of trying to educate their population. And so he was like, well, I'm going to tell great stories and have kids learn about science. And I'm also going to talk about all the exchange rates from all the different currencies while they're raising money for this crazy thing so that they'll have to do math too. So yeah. It's an interesting combination of like cartoonish, heroic, and didactic. I think when I was a kid, I read a lot of my dad's science fiction books, which were like Heinlein. I remember particularly The Star Beast, and I might have been a little older than 12, but there's something I think of all the time whenever I'm in a Slack, and they have the Slack bots and you give them things.
Yeah.
There's a total throwaway thing in a Heinlein book called The Number of the Beast, where they are programming a thing that will talk to them in their little spaceship, and they give it different weights for different potential comments it could say, and it snarks at them. And it's like programmed. It's not pretending to be a sentient artificial intelligence or anything. It's just a thing they do for fun. And we do exactly that now. And I wonder if anyone was inspired by that, or because it's such a small detail in this book.
Yeah.
Could be just something that's totally forgotten and we've come around to in a different way.
That's interesting. What about you, Wick?
The two authors that come to my mind when I was 12 the most are Isaac Asimov and Michael Crichton. I was obsessed with both those authors. And the concepts from those that really stand out to me are the Foundation series, Psychohistory, where he comes up with a probabilistic predictive model to predict what's going to happen to civilization over the next 10,000 years. Yeah. That totally captivated me. And then how the mule, that one person just breaks the model, which that blew my mind. And then I've always been captivated by the concept of a self-aware robot. Always. Yeah. Ever since I read, like iRobot and iRobot particularly.
Yeah.
That has influenced my writing a ton. I've written at least 3 or 4 books with self-aware robots in them, because it's just like a robot discovering their journey of who they are. We mirror that. Like, there's just something so human about that.
Yeah.
And then in Jurassic Park, the concept of taking genes, like that was really big in the 90s when I read it.
Yep.
And doing stuff with genetics. Thinking about that at the time when that came into the popular zeitgeist to now, and the absolute leaps in advancement of genomics and genetic technology are like, I'm not an expert in that field, but I kind of don't doubt that we could create a dinosaur like right now from, if we had the DNA. I mean, it's something that could probably happen.
Have you seen the work that they've done with that, with chickens, like where they've put basically made a chicken into a miniature T-Rex? They messed with it in the egg, changed the DNA. Like, it's crazy.
Yeah. And they're doing There's a lot going on with organ transplant, with creating pig organs specifically, not just like creating pig organs in a lab specifically to like heart and lungs to transplant into patients. That is like
wild.
That actually will probably be a reality in possibly the next couple of years.
Yeah, they're also 3D printing organs now.
Yeah,
I did see that.
Yeah,
that's nuts.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Well, and that's one of the things that I will say that I've learned from thinking about these things and looking at what was written then and what's possible now, is that instead of thinking about, what would be possible to do in the future, I think, what problem do I need to solve?
Yeah.
And that's the technology that I start to say, I wish that this existed. Mm-hmm. Like if I had something that just gave everybody a name badge every time I saw them. Oh my goodness.
That's funny. I was going to ask, Wick, this is very random and hopefully it'll be quick. It'll probably be a quick answer. You said you started reading Foundation when you were a kid. How young were you when you started reading Foundation? I just cannot imagine a kid reading Foundation.
I started reading what? Sorry, you broke up a little bit.
Sorry about that. Sorry. Foundation, you said you started reading that as a kid. I just cannot imagine.
Like a teenager.
Oh, okay.
And I've read it 3 times since. I just reread it. I just reread it, and although it still stands up. I mean, it was written in the 50s, so it's full of like misogyny and patriarchy, but it still stands up. That the science fiction that is amazing.
Yeah,
right.
I also read it with early teens.
Goes back to what Sue said about what age 12 being your golden age for reading science fiction.
So I have a theory on this, which is that you start reading science fiction when you're a kid, and you're reading that you read it because it's shelved with everything else, because they don't separate by genre, and you love it. And then you go to school, and then you go to college, and you do not have time to read. When you finally have time to read again, you think, I'm going to read that book that I used to love, but it's a book that's written for kids.
Yeah.
And so you read it and you're like, I don't like science fiction, because you're reading something that's outdated. But if the people who transition, who don't stop reading the science fiction, who continue reading it as adults, we're still having our golden age. I'm sorry, I'm turning 56 this month. My golden age, like, it has just not stopped.
Yeah.
I feel that same way. Absolutely.
So we have a duty to make people read contemporary science fiction, which is to say what you guys are writing.
What all of us are writing.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, when I was a kid reading my dad's science fiction, it was just one of the things I read. I mean, I never thought of myself as particularly a science fiction writer, and I still read a whole bunch of different stuff, as Sue said. But I do think the science fiction that I read now is so much better. Thanks to all of you. Highline has some stuff and some other good stuff from back then and all, but yeah. And another thing that I think was quite interesting, because Mary Robinette, like you, I also read a lot of Anne McCaffrey, and there's a whole genre of like science fiction that's so far forward it has become fantasy.
Yes.
Right. And often you don't know until farther. And Elizabeth Bear's Dust series is another one of those. Mm-hmm. And like the Pern books, which when you start reading them are very much like high fantasy coded, and then you get to a certain point and there's all this genetic stuff and space travel and other things going on. And it's another thing that I think is quite interesting in the way that it appeals to people and the sorts of things it teaches us to expect.
That's a good point. I'm wondering, so yesterday I was moderating the panel about advanced technology, like how to write it better, in books, and one of the things that one of the people watching brought up was that at some point, like, advanced technology just becomes magic. Like, what do y'all think about that thought? Like, do you agree with that or not?
Oh, I think it's the other way around. I think magic becomes advanced technology. Because like this, This is based on what? This is based on lightning.
True.
Like this is a spell that does one trick. It turns things on and it turns things off. That is all lightning does. Lights it up. I mean, fries it. But and we figured out how to make this magic rock do a ton of stuff based on that one spell. So I tend to think that what we do is we see something that's magic, and then because we are pattern-based creatures, we figure out how to technologize it, and then we have technology. And if you don't understand how technology works, then yes, it looks like magic. You know, my magic rock, I sometimes joke about writing a pure fantasy book in which their magic works the way my cell phone does, or the way give me a moment. I can make water emerge from this wall if I do my hands in the right complicated pass. You know, the way the airport lavatories work. Or I just have to find a good signal to the gods. You know, I'm in a cave. I can't speak to the gods. My path is blocked.
You all heard it here. Mary Robinette Kowal is writing a book for 2026. So
I've run out of magic energy. I can't call until it rests. I think that's true, but I think it also does go the other way, because as our technology gets more and more complex, it means that no one person really fully understands the full thing that's happening.
Yeah.
At which point it is again magic, you know, and so I think there's this whole spectrum of how it goes in our understanding.
Yeah. I mean, we all know a very good magic spell. Turn it off and then back on again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and what do your cats think? Because I know they push buttons and it has meaning
Mm-hmm.
to you and to them.
Yeah.
How do they understand that?
That's a good question. It's harder to ask her that kind of question because I'd have to introduce the word technology. I know that sometimes she will say to me, "Talk device." So she's hello. We're going on a field trip.
Because my cat understood a TV as a window to someplace she couldn't get.
Yeah, Elsie will talk about window. So these are her buttons.
Love that. That's amazing.
There's Elsie. Catnip. Sorry, kid. I can't do catnip now.
Wow.
So she definitely knows that, like, I'm over here. So what's going on, kid?
That's
Sorry,
wild.
I did not. Yeah.
No, I love whenever I see one of those videos come across my Instagram feed, I'm always watching them because I think it's so interesting that we've reached the point where animals can like tell us human words, like very specific. Like, that's crazy.
To be clear, she's not speaking English. We are communicating using this.
Yeah.
But it's more like having a pigeon. But it has fundamentally changed the way I write science fiction because I'm having a conversation with a non-human creature, a non-human intelligence on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And the way she views the world, she verbs pretty much every noun that exists. So one of the examples is hair tie. For her, hair tie, because I would fling them across the room. Hair tie means throw to her.
Wow.
So she'll say hair tie kibble.
Oh, funny.
She wants me to throw the kibble so she can chase it.
So
And she will combine words, but to like reflection on the ceiling is laser bird.
Wow.
But the thing is, I don't know if it's laser because it moves quickly, if it's laser because it's bright. I don't know if it's bird because it flutters, if it's bird because it's high, if it's bird because it's something she wants to eat. Like, I don't know what it means, but we have enough of an overlap. And so when I think about writing aliens, when I think about that kind of science fiction, I'm thinking about the fact that their worldview is just not going to be the same as mine.
Yeah. That reminds me of the Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, and that initial conversation that he was having with the extraterrestrial. I don't know if y'all read that book yet, but it took them a while to get to a point where they were communicating in a normal way, because they just didn't understand things the same. So that's interesting. All right, so I want to go ahead and jump to another question. So sorry, my lights are motion activated. Thankfully, I have one. I knew that was going to happen, so I put another light over here. I would still be lit when they turn off. So I'm trying to see which one I want to ask here. Okay, so what technology advancements have you seen very specifically? Like when you think back to those books that you've read, and we've kind of already been discussing this a little bit, but I would love to hear some specific examples, if you could think of any, of sci-fi in books that you have seen come to fruition. And I would love to talk a little bit about that. So Malka, do you have anything in mind that comes to your head that's stood out to you?
I mean, definitely what Mary Robinette said earlier, that the way we are communicating now, the television phone was, I guess, an idea. The screens on Star Trek, that idea was around, and I still remember the early days of Skype, and thinking, wow, we can do this, and it's free, and just how amazing all of this is for communication. Yeah, it's incredible.
I remember when it switched from computers to phone, and I was in elementary school or something, and I just remember being like, wow, that's crazy. I can see my granddad on on my mom's phone now, that's crazy. So
Yeah, like a Dick Tracy wristwatch.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Neil, as I was thinking about this question, thinking what sci-fi I think has become more true to life.
Yeah.
I realized that the cyberpunk genre unfortunately represents our current modern the whole, a lot of cyberpunk novels like Snow Crash and Blade Runner and things like that. The curated infotainment that we all have, the marketplace of realities, the gig economy, like Uber and stuff like that, like being able to press a button and be like, hey, a car is here. That was in sci-fi, and that was really cool. But then I look at how that actually came about and what it actually looks like today, and it's much more nefarious than I would like it to be when I'm daydreaming about, hey, but when you read cyberpunk novels, particularly Snow Crash, the cryptocratic social structure of Snow Crash.
Right.
And I've read a lot of sci-fi. Is the most, I think, what we are living in currently of all the sci-fi I've read. I really think, unfortunately, I think that's kind of the reality.
Yeah. Oh man, that we definitely need to talk about at some point in this panel. We need to talk about how technologies that in sci-fi that were thought to be a good thing that have come to fruition have actually transitioned to maybe a negative thing, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that. But so I know all of our brains are going a certain direction, but we can probably branch out from AI a little bit, I'm sure. So,
but I think that's the role of science fiction, is not to predict the future, but to warn about the future. And I think Arthur C. Clarke said that first. And so that when cyberpunk was coming up, and we had computers, and they do really cool things, and they still do, but computers can do so much harm to us, and they are doing harm to us.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think words have power, and I think the idea that science fiction exists to warn us about the future is one of the things that is actually a danger. I think that science fiction can model the future, and that we do not, as writers, spend enough time modeling how can we do this better. Like the gig economy, talking about the dangers of it, but also saying, but this is how it could look. This is what it would look like if it were working well. You know, one of the problems with Star Trek, as much as I love it, is that they don't talk about what supports the Federation. They're starting to get into that more now, but with some of the series. But I think that's a thing that you can do, is say, you know, it could look like this. We did. Was fortunate enough to get a grant to run something that we called the Space Economy Camp for Writers. And it was pairing writers with economists to talk about how to model non-exploitive economic futures, sustainable ones. And one of the things we hit upon was the power of the idiom. So not Asimov, Heinlein for the moon has "there ain't no such thing as a free lunch." That models a very specific future and a very specific path. But if you have a society that models one person's problem is everyone's problem, then that models a very different future for what a society on the moon could look like. So I agree that warning of the dangers of technology is a thing that science fiction can do, but I think that one of the more difficult things is to think about, okay, but how can we do it in a way that doesn't mess things up for everybody? Like, what are the possible golden ages?
That's
Naomi Kreitzer and Cory Doctorow are doing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Awesome. Malka, you've been quiet down there. What thoughts has this been in your mind?
I mean, I agree very much that I think science fiction needs to do both. I think there are people who are open to warning, and I think there are people who are open to dreaming of better things. And, you know, I think what I mainly try to do with mine is to try to distance people from the expectation that what we are living now is inevitable and the only way that it's possible. Yeah. So, you know, whether I'm presenting something, I try not to do like full on utopia, dystopia, and I try to do things that are just different in significant ways that will make people say, no, that is plausible. No, we could actually change this. And maybe some things will get worse and some things will get better, but probably we can improve as a whole. And I think that is just so important because we have so many forms of media that are reinforcing over and over again. This is just the way it is.
Yeah.
I was just talking to my wife the other last night about there's these two concepts popularized by Timothy Snyder. He's a political writer, the politics of inevitability and the politics of eternity, and how autocratic leaders use those politics to make you think you cannot get out of this cycle. It lasts forever. This is it, over and over again, the politics of eternity. Yeah. And I do think science fiction has a huge role in being like, no, it doesn't, like, look at this. It doesn't have to be this way. And I honestly think that's how lots of change can happen, is when people use their imaginations a little bit more and understands that the politics of inevitability and eternity are lies and, you know, basically propaganda.
Yes.
Yeah, one of the other things that is a foundation for a lot of science fiction is the tragedy of the commons, which is also not true.
Yeah.
And it turns out that when that was a piece of propaganda that was invented essentially in order to justify taking community resources.
Absolutely.
Would you mind explaining that term for me? I'm not sure I'm completely aware. I feel like I've heard it before, but I don't know if I know the definition of that.
Yeah, the tragedy of the commons is the idea that if you have a common resource like a village green that everybody can graze their cows on, or woods or something like that, that someone will come in and take it all for themselves. And so you have to have someone managing that resource in order to prevent people from stripping it bare, which is, it turns out, not actually how that plays out.
I would disagree, because if you look at what's going on in space right now and all the things that are being sent up there, that I mean, we're getting at satellites, and there's something called the Kessler syndrome, where you get so much stuff in orbit that the orbit becomes unusable. And that is happening. We have a commons up there that is being abused by people who have their own technological plan. I agree with you that very often, if you have a good society, they're going to manage their commons, and you don't need an outside someone to come and take that. But I think that it can happen.
I understand your anecdote, but the science on that is points the other direction. Malka actually has a degree in this, so I'm going to let her talk.
Well, my degree is in the sociology of organizations, and I have a degree in economics as a master's. But I'm not an expert. I have not read as much as I would like to on the new science that refutes the tragedy of the commons. But I think that in the case of space, particularly and orbit, it's not a commons.
It's not,
because there are very few people who have access to it. They have access to it in specific ways. And so, it functions very differently. It's also, in the case of like a specific orbit, it's not a renewable resource if managed correctly in the same way as some place where you're growing. So I think it's a slightly different situation that you're talking about. But as I understand it, the recent research on this is quite good. And of course, there are different situations and different types of commons that will play out differently. But we do see a lot of pro-social activity among people, where people find ways to share and to apportion resources in reasonable ways. And you say, when it's a good society, and I think it's so hard to figure out when a society is good or not. But I do think we can say, that there are pressures that make it much harder to do that. And when we compare ourselves to a English village in the 17th century, obviously they also had a bunch of pressures and insecurities. But when we're facing very different pressures in terms of the way things are structured and the expectations that there are of what people need to do to take care of themselves and their families.
Mm-hmm. Sue, do you have any other thoughts on that? Since you seem to have.
I appreciate the different opinions, and
yeah.
It's really interesting stuff that's going on in that research. And Mary Robinette, what's the name of the scientist who wrote about that a lot? It was a woman, right? I can't remember.
I could have told you that like last summer, and cannot tell you that now. Yeah, it's Google. To my magic rock.
Yes.
Love it. Wick, you brought that up. I'm curious, what are your, you have any thoughts after that conversation? What?
Eleanor Ostrom is the name of the woman that you should read if you want to find out more about this. Ostrom.
Neil, what was your question? Brought up what?
I believe you brought it up initially about what the conversation you were having with your wife, I believe. And I didn't know if you had any thoughts.
What brought it up?
Or just,
what brought up the conversation?
Well, no, I just didn't know if you had any other thoughts on that, since we kind of been hopping around. I don't know if you finished your thought that you were saying.
Sorry, you broke up one more time.
Oh,
sorry.
I'm sorry about that. Is this happening for everybody? Is my screen? Okay, no, okay. Sorry.
Maybe it's just me.
It's the cold.
I'm good.
Okay, perfect. Great. That's really good. Let's see what other questions, or is there anything else anybody wants to add to this topic, or like a different, like in this question I asked earlier about technologies that they've seen that were brought up in science fiction, and then like as a positive note, and were later maybe taken a little more negatively in modern context.
I think there's one thing it's solar punk, which is trying to imagine a future where we get over the climate crisis, because that is happening. But then what? What do we do? What's going to happen after that? Is there a way through that? And those are questions that solarpunk is trying to answer.
Mm.
Yeah, I think one of the things that that I think we are on the path for is the the corporations that you see in like Murderbot, where you belong to a corporation. That's a bad choice. No. Where you belong to a corporation where you can't get away from the corporation because you have some form of indenture to it. And I think that we're seeing that particularly in America with the way our healthcare system is structured, that people wind up trapped because they cannot leave, because they lose their healthcare because they have a pre-existing condition if they let it lapse even for a day.
Yeah.
And so I think we're on the path to that, which is terrifying.
Murderbot came to my mind when I was thinking about these questions. That corporatocratic social structure of Murderbot is a terrible model that you can literally see in every space we occupy in society. You can see that kind of corporatocracy and happening, and particularly definitely in medicine. Definitely.
Yeah. That's good. Yeah, I was just sorry when y'all said solar punk a second ago. I was just thinking I've started reading a book recently that's short stories. It's by Flame Tree Publishing. I don't know if y'all know that publishing arm, but they have a really nice like short story collection that just came out on solar punk, and it's really good. Sorry, just throwing that out there. But that's really good. I'm wondering. My brain immediately when I think of science fiction and today goes to like technologies, but I think that y'all are hitting on some good points that science fiction isn't just about like advancements in technologies and things. It's also about government systems and, just that. How do you see science fiction playing a role in guiding society, or not guiding, but like pointing out, so like y'all said, it could point out negatives and positives. Like, how do you see though that really, like, how do authors take that into account when they're writing? Like, how do they think through that process? And Mary Robinette mentioned, a minute ago, she had that group that you had put together. That sounded really good. But any other thoughts on like how authors can really like take steps to not be set in one mindset when they're writing sci-fi, and how to branch out?
Looking at history is a good way. I think Ada Palmer's I can't remember my brain has just let go of the name of her book.
Too like the lightning.
Too Like the Lightning. Yeah, that's a really good example of it, imagining a future that comes from remote working. Like the way those paths could lead us to that future is really interesting. I tend to look at historical patterns, and I try to make sure that when I'm looking at historical patterns, I'm not just looking at European ones, because there are ways that we tend to respond to social pressures. A lot of the things that we're seeing right now, although this is a European example, a lot of them are comparable to what happened with the Luddites, where propaganda was being placed about what the Luddites were standing for, which was a disruption of their way of life and unsafe working conditions. And propaganda was being put out that they were against progress. And you're seeing the same kind of things happening now with conversations around different technologies that come into place.
That's good. Anybody else?
Oh, I was just reading as much nonfiction as possible. I mean, history and economics. I read so much history and economics books, like more than anything. Lots of different. I mean that, and a lot of anthropology books and sociology books, I think, are weaving that. When you read stuff, nonfiction, and then as you write fiction, it just seamlessly goes into your subconscious. Like that stuff just starts popping up in my writing. Like I'm like, oh yeah, like a book that I've written, when I go over it, I'm like, I literally could go page by page. I'm like, this idea probably came from these couple books I read. This came from these other nonfiction books I read. This came from reading about, the history of China during this time. Like I don't think there's anything more important than reading nonfiction, and particularly history, and for me, economics, sociology, and anthropology.
That's great advice.
I was going to say also that, there's the time travel of reading history, but there's also literal travel, geographic travel.
Mm-hmm.
The future is unevenly distributed. We're time traveling in some ways as you go to different places. There's a older book than Gibson called it's called Los Pasos Perdidos, the Lost Steps, by Alejo Carpintero, which also very literally has this guy going into the past by traveling into the rainforest, which has, problematic elements to that framing. But if we're thinking about differences, if we're thinking about being attuned to the wide array of human experience, and traveling doesn't necessarily have to mean traveling very far, because there's so much inequality, there's so much variation, there's so many different cultures within very small areas, which is wonderful. Density is great. And diversity is great because you get to see lots of things. So just getting out of your comfort zone and making sure that you're interacting with people who have different approaches to everything.
I need to add to that, because I am also a translator and translate science fiction, is read fiction from other countries. And it can be slightly different. It can be very different. And their vision of the future can be very different as well.
Yes.
So that's an easy way to travel and read science fiction at the same time. And there's really cool stuff out there.
Yes.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I was thinking of Malka when you were saying that. It reminded me of Heart of Darkness. I can't think of why can I not think of who that's by?
Joseph Conrad.
Yes, Joseph Conrad. But that's totally different. That's not sci-fi, and it has totally different implications. But anyway, okay, that's really good. So there was actually a question over here that I wanted to bring up and see if y'all had any thoughts on. I'll put it on the screen. It says, when does the nearness of new science make the genre speculative fiction instead of sci-fi? Or does that even happen? Is it always sci-fi? Like, I'm just curious your thoughts. Does anybody want to jump on that?
I just have a thought about Malka's Infomocracy. That is kind of speculative. I mean, that is near to speculative fiction.
Yeah.
What you've written there.
I mean, I honestly always use speculative fiction as an umbrella term so that I can include science fiction, alt history, fantasy, all those things into one term. So I'm not actually sure how we're talking about it in this sense.
I am very sloppy in my word use.
No.
Yeah, I unfortunately also am in that boat. I think what you're getting at is that when are you in danger of kind of it's so close that it's like it's near future. So like James Bond is science fiction, right? The devices he uses don't exist, but it's happening in our real world. I unfortunately, coming out of puppet theater, every time I hear someone say speculative fiction instead of sci-fi, it reminds me of this period of time we went through with puppet theater where people would, in order to get over the stigma of doing puppetry, you would say, "Oh, I do figure theater." And people would say, "Well, what's that?" And you're like, "Well, it's a puppet show." And so unfortunately, when I hear speculative fiction, it's like, "Oh, no, I do speculative fiction. It's not sci-fi." That I think what we're talking about in this case is that it has to be incredibly grounded. It can't have elements of sheer imagination in it. But there's this part of my brain that always hears, "Oh, no, I do figure theater."
Awesome. Anybody else have anything? No?
I think the closer, when you're writing science fiction, the closer you get to that line of, hey, this is pure science fiction, or speculative fiction in the sense that, like, hey, maybe this is kind of close to what's going on. I think the closer you get to that line, probably the more tension you create for the reader, and it's probably very engaging. the closer you get to that line.
Yeah. I think the biggest part, the biggest problem with writing something that's near science, near future is, or contemporary science fiction is actually the social political landscape, just making guesses about that.
Well, I wrote a novel about a coronavirus outbreak, and I started it before 2020, but that's when it came out. And now I am prohibited by my husband from writing any near science fiction because he thinks I predict things or make things happen. But that's the problem, is that when I first thought of it, that's cool. Coronaviruses are very interesting, but I didn't predict the future.
I'd be curious to know, when you wrote that, like what differences came up, like that you saw from, because you got to write it so close to when that actually happened, almost, like something similar happened. Like, how accurate was your writing compared to what actually happened?
What actually happened was we handled it so badly. I mean, everything that we should have done, we did not do. We made it terribly worse. More people died. So there was that. Otherwise, but that was the politics of it, as Mary Robinette said.
I had a book that came out in 2020 that had a polio outbreak on the moon. So also technically a pandemic, because it was the entire planet. Yeah. But it was fascinating watching our responses to that, while looking at the responses that people had to the polio outbreak. And then I had also been looking for different reasons at the response to the flu in 1918, and the weird imprints that it leaves on our society. And the weird imprints are the ones that I think it's hard to predict. Mm-hmm. So when you read science fiction that's set in the future, no one wears masks. And it's impossible for me to imagine a future now where there's no one wearing masks. Maybe not everybody, but like people would have them on. When you, if you are reading something pre-polio outbreak, sending kids away to summer camp was not a thing. That's a thing that's a very common American experience, that you go away for summer camp. That happened because they knew that polio happened in the summer, and they knew it hit kids in the city. And so your goal was to get your kids out of the city in the summer. They didn't know why, but that was where summer camps come from. Our gleaming, the gleaming porcelain bathrooms. Yeah, those are remnants of influenza. The radiator heating in particularly in New York, but if you're in an apartment building that has the old radiators, and you're like, it is the only way you can make the apartment bearable is to open a window, is because they were designed to heat the apartment with a window open so that you got air circulation because of the flu. And so there are these weird things that are still around that we don't recognize as being weird because they're just part of our fabric. Mm-hmm. Those are the pieces that, when I think about science fiction in the future, set in the future, those are the pieces that I'm like, I know that those aren't going to be there when I'm writing it, because it's hard to know what's going to stick.
Yeah. That's good. So this brings up another question I had sent to y'all beforehand. What are some like technologies that or science or just science fiction concepts that you think that authors today should really be focusing on in writing? And obviously not everybody writes the same things, but what are some thoughts that you think that you wish you saw more in sci-fi to help us, like get us to a point, like like kind of we've talked about earlier, how sci-fi influences the future a little bit. What are some topics you think that you want to see more of in science fiction today?
Counter technologies. Counter surveillance technologies. Neil Stephenson is one of my favorite contemporary sci-fi writers, and he, like in one of his books, he had he showed like a social media feed and there was a curator, a specific curator for that person, like a live human person, that was their job, was to curate their social media feed for them. And then he also had another book about, climate geoengineering, by shooting sulfur pellets into the atmosphere, which is, there's a whole science behind that. Anyway, I just think climate geoengineering, to combat climate change, and then technologies to counter the harmful effect of technologies.
That's good. Anybody else got any thoughts? What do you hope to see in some sci-fi in the near future?
We touched on this, I think, earlier a bit when you said that, science fiction is not just technologies. And certainly I try to write a lot about societies. And I mean, it's actually all technology. Democracy is a technology.
Mm-hmm.
It's a technology that we should spend a lot more time refining and thinking about. It was actually really surprising to me at one point after Infomocracy came out, and someone was like, yeah, we're trying to write something about your book and we want to pair it with other books about democracy. And it's really hard to find them. And it's, it's the happy ending phenomenon, like in Elizabethan plays where the marriage was the happy ending. And so you didn't get a lot of plays about actually being married. And now, of course, we have endless books about being married from certain perspectives. But, this idea that, oh, it's democracy, we're finished, we're done, we got the good thing. But there's a lot more to it than that. And similarly with the economic work that Mary Robinette is doing. And so thinking about, what are the different social technologies we could find to build better societies that do better with commons and other things. I think I would like to see a lot more thought about that, a lot more thought about how we work together. I know we're going to have a plug time in a minute, but I'm just finished editing, along with Annalee Newitz and Karen Lord, an anthology of speculative fiction, including fantasy and far science fiction and near science fiction, about collective action and activism. And we approached it like one of these anthologies where writers talk to scientists, we talk to activists. We asked all the writers to interview an activist that they admired or someone who worked to change things for the better. And then everyone wrote stories about them. And I'd like to see a lot more thinking about the social technologies.
That's great. Thank you. Anybody else?
I'm actually, they Malka hit it for me also. I'm like, I'd love to see that. I've always said that as a freelancer, what I've been trying to do is curate my life so that I can turn down the gigs I don't want to do. And when I talk about science, the things that we create with science, I want science that allows me to not have to do the things I don't want to do. And so imagining science fiction that, technology that is supportive of people that have ADHD, people that are in the arts, and how can they do that and also have a sustainable living? Like, what are the ways in which we can use technology so that people can do the things they want to do, that demonstrate what humans are good at, without breaking people. Universal basic income.
Nice. Yes. You know what, that reminds me of the newer, it's not new, but the newer fantasy subgenre that's been really popular in the past couple of years, cozy fantasy. I could almost see that type of science fiction work be like cozy sci-fi in a way, where it's like, just simple concepts of making people's lives better and how that impacts their day-to-day life. I could see that being something that could arise in the near future.
I'll tell you a secret, that when I was writing the Martian Contingency, I realized I was having a hard time with it, and I realized it was because I just wanted to write a cozy. But the last book in the series was a thriller, so I had to mask my cozy as a thriller.
Oh my goodness. That's awesome.
But it's a lot of people having parties while like shenanigans happen. This does not describe the book at all. Someone in the comments says Becky Chambers' work is arguably cozy sci-fi, and I would 100%. I don't think there's any argument about that. That's very
For
much.
But I would say Murderbot in many ways is too.
Yeah.
Even though it presents this awful situation for a lot of people, it also presents alternatives that are extremely positive. And it presents also a vision really of people working together and supporting each other in unexpected ways.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Agreed.
Well, yeah, that's one of the other things science fiction does is it asks, what if? What if we could do this? What if we could do that? And the places where we can do that are because it's science fiction. We can speculate anywhere. What is the science? The soft sciences, the hard sciences.
That's good. Anybody else? Okay, so I mentioned this in the comments. If anybody has any questions out there that they would like us to talk about in our last few minutes, I would love to bring those up. But I do have a couple other questions that we can go into while we wait on people coming up. Here, I'll ask one and we'll let some questions come in. So what, it's actually not a question I have on my list. I'm curious to know what things in your work specifically, did you write for some of the implications that we've already been talking about? And we already did, Malka kind of brought up some of the stuff she's written about, but I'm curious to hear some of the rest of you share a little bit about some things that you wrote about in hopes of bringing about a better future from your works.
So in the Lady Astronaut universe, one of the things that I was trying to do was what happens if you make the kinder choice. So for people who are unfamiliar with the books, I slam an asteroid into Washington, D.C. in 1952, and I kick off the space program fast and early. But I kill a lot of people, except your friends and family who are in DC. Canonically, they were on vacation, along with all the cats who just knew that the meteor was coming. But what I tried to do was that I tried to model what it looks like when people communicate and when they work together. And while I have people making, disagreeing with each other, they are all disagreeing in service of let's try to make things better. One of the things that we see historically, but we specifically saw during COVID, the initial lockdown, was that when we do not have a script for something, we look to a leader to tell us how to behave. And the difference between the way different countries responded, particularly I'm thinking of New Zealand. New Zealand's leader was basically a mom and was like, don't make me pull this country over. And set an example for how do people behave. And the way that played out in New Zealand was very different than the way things played out here and the way things played out in other countries.
Yeah.
So I tried, even though I wrote that before the pandemic, what I tried to do was to demonstrate what things would look like if you had a leader who was not denying science, who was listening, who was taking advice, who was thinking ahead about the ways things could go wrong and trying to disaster-proof for a planet, like where all of everybody was cooperating. And so that's something that I think about when I write is what happens if I let my character make a kinder choice, because I'll tell you, de-escalating is much harder than escalating.
Yeah, that makes sense. What about you, Sue?
Well, one of the things I did in my trilogy, the Semiosis trilogy, was I did a lot of research into what plants are doing, and people don't pay a lot of attention to botany and to trees. Their plant blindness is a thing. But what's going on is astounding. What plants can do, I tried to make everything that plants could do in the book, things that they actually are doing on Earth, except think. Plants don't think the way that we do. It's a big debate. Do they think at all? Possibly they do. We know they can remember things. We know they make decisions. But if they could think like us, that was the only magic thing I did. And the rest of it, can they communicate with us? Well, they do. I mean, think about a tomato. When the tomato turns red, the plant is telling you, eat that tomato, because you're going to take the seeds and move them somewhere else. So a whole bunch of things that plants do, and they communicate with each other, and they fight, and they can deal with different situations. And what I hope to do, I joke that I want to make you afraid of your garden, but what I really want you to do is understand that the plants are living things, they're reacting in their environment, they have their own dramas, and that what they're doing is really important, and we're also dependent on them.
Yeah.
And in our own time, we abuse them a lot, and breaks my heart to see what is going on in some places.
Yeah, I think that my plants that I'm trying to grow in my garden over the past couple of years are mad at humans because they just won't produce fruit for me, and I can't figure out why. So if you could talk to them, Sue, that would be...
They're trying. They're really trying.
What about you, Wick?
I wrote a book where aliens show up in the sky and they don't do anything, and then they land everywhere in every country, and they don't do anything. They don't hatch or anything. They just sit there, and the world obviously freaks out. And one country blows up the pods in their country, and they're like, "Hey, if you don't blow up yours, we're going to do it for you." And then that sparks nuclear warfare. And then this book is 20 years later, post-apocalyptic, from humanity's own overreaction. And the main character is a doctor, and she was a pathologist before the fall, and now she has to run the only hospital in San Francisco, and it's 20 years post modernity. She has one medical student, a ragtag team of nurses, and she is the only adult in the room. Meaning the mayor, this takes place in California, and there's different mayors of San Diego and Sacramento and San Francisco, and they're all vying for power. It's all like political, and all she cares about is salvaging some medical supplies to just keep her like hospital running that nobody really understands anymore, except the nurses, the old world nurses. And and then she finds a dead alien in the bay, and she was a pathologist, so now she needs to do an autopsy and figure out what's going on. But just mirroring what Mary Robinette said, that character is so in me. Like she's the only adult in the room. Everybody else only cares about power grab, and she's just silently in the background being a normal, decent human being who's angry and flawed and all that stuff. But that just mirroring that comment that like trying to just do what's right, and regardless of the circumstances and all these things that happen in the book, and she still care. Even the mayors who like created this war and actually killed, like, people died from it, she still like bandages their wounds in a battle because she's just the only adult in the room. That was like my main thing with that book. And that character, just like I admire, like, of every character I've written, I just like admire this person. Just mirroring what Mary Robinette said about, I forget what the original question is, but I guess that compassion, radical compassion, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Writing about radical compassion, I think, is, yeah.
That's good. Malka, is there anything else you want to share about yours that is like really something that you care deeply about, that you write about in your books?
I mean, I think I already mentioned that I care deeply about sort of how societies work, how people work together. You know, the Infomocracy series is basically about that. Like, how could we organize ourselves a bit differently? It's also about the power of information, which is something that I care a lot about. This is also a day job for me as well. And that very much we need to be thinking about our information, where it comes from, who we're listening to, how it gets transmitted. I think also just that it's really important that we turn around the assumptions. As I said before, a lot of what I'm trying to do is not necessarily say, this is better or this is worse, but it could be different. And we have so many basic assumptions about what we value and what we put forward. I have one short story in one of my collections where instead of artificial intelligence, it's a machine that was designed to be an artificial empathy.
Wow.
And so the whole idea is, maybe we need empathy at least as much as we need intelligence. And, if we're not able to actually muster it ourselves in our decision makers, maybe we need a machine to do that for us. Maybe that's a more worthwhile thing to build. So yeah, just trying to think about, why are we all chasing after this one particular thing? Why do we still think that territory is the way that we should organize our political groupings? Why I just try to ask those questions, and depending on how they play out and how interesting and varied the answers are, they become short stories or novels. And then sometimes, like Mary Robinette, I just want to write something cozy, and then it's murder mysteries on Jupiter.
It's amazing how cozy a murder is, isn't it?
It is, as long as it's the right person who gets got.
Yes.
Like, this is important.
Awesome. I thought this was an interesting comment. But the true path to empathy is experience, not sure I want a machine teaching me. But I don't know if it's the machine. It's just helping you. I think y'all are saying it just helps you, or you were saying it just helps you get to empathy, right?
It wasn't actually supposed to teach people empathy, because it hit it at the point that the story takes place, decided that was a lost cause. But it was supposed to present, when we think about artificial intelligence as making decisions, it was supposed to make sure that the empathy was included in decision making.
Yeah. That makes sense.
And I think, empathy can come from experience, but I don't think it necessarily does. I think a lot of times you see very small children who have zero experience, who see someone else get hurt and get upset.
Yeah.
I think that, it has to come from actually making yourself think about other people, or feeling that in some instinctive way. I'm not sure experience helps.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, last question, and then we'll go to the final, what are you working on, or what's going on with you these days? So a lot of science fiction fantasy is escapist in nature, particularly fantasy. Is there still room for escapism in sci-fi, even as the future looks increasingly less optimistic?
Look, the future always looks less optimistic depending on where you're standing. When I was in elementary school, we were doing bomb drills for nuclear war. And I have to tell you that I do not think that hiding under your desk was actually going to protect you if someone dropped a bomb on the city. But that was the future that I was growing up in. And the future that I'm growing up in now looks bad, but we're still progressing. So I'm not excited about the things that we're going to have to live through to get to the other side of stuff. But I also I also think that the future does not look any worse than it has in the past. It's just a different bad that's in front of us. And is there still room for escapism? Absolutely. Yes. Yes. Always.
Agreed.
Yeah, I just did a panel Sunday night with Ursula Vernon and Martha Wells, where we were talking specifically about comfort reading, which is, a lot of it is escapism, although a lot of it we decided is also anger, and stuff that feels angry in the right ways, and in that anger being expressed against the right people. But one of the things we talked about was that escapism can be really important for continuing to fight, to resist, to survive. And I think if you look, I don't know, I'm not a film studies expert, but I remember hearing that they say, in the Depression, it was all bubbly, frothy musical comedies, and it's useful. And I also I'm not sure that fantasy is actually more escapist than science fiction. I can think of some awfully grim fantasy. I mean,
Grimdark.
the
Genre.
the Trader Baruch-Cormorant. Like, let's start with that grim fantasy, and very powerful and very apt and very political. And there's a lot of science fiction that's really, really extremely escapist, because technology is going to solve all our problems, or the single hero who knows how to use technology is going to solve all our problems, and the future is therefore great as long as you're one of those people. So yeah, I'm just gonna. I think sometimes fantasy gets shunted aside as being very escapist and very unreal, and a lot of it is, and some of it is, which, as I said, is great, but a lot of it is very, very sharp.
I feel like in fantasy, like murders or death tends to be very violent. In sci-fi, it's like, oh, they got thrown out of a ship. But, there's kind of all you say about it. They died, but it's not violent. I feel like fantasy can be very violent. So,
well, let me put in a plug for a piece that I translated, a short story, and it appears in the December Clark's World. It's called The Coffee Machine by Celia Corral Vasquez, and she's in Spain. And it is a story where there's a coffee machine and it gets sentience. And then a whole bunch of other machines get it, and then a bunch of stuff happens. It is hysterically funny. And it's science fiction. And is it escapism? And, well, it's a comedy. So it can be done. It is done. And I really enjoyed translating that story because I got to make all the jokes funny in English. So, yeah, there's lots of room for that. And I could name other things. I like reading Adrian Tchaikovsky, where he invents all of these alien ecologies and then stuff happens. But then the whole thing is like, wow, it really would work. And so, yeah, I read that for the fun of it. Is that escapism? I don't know. I just enjoy it.
It sounds very, like we were saying, like cozy sci-fi. I think I need to look into more cozy sci-fi. I didn't realize how much there was, but now that I'm hearing all y'all talk about it, I'm like, I need to find more.
No, Tchaikovsky isn't cozy. He kills a lot of people.
Oh, okay.
I think John Scalzi's Kaiju Preservation Society. Like that is escapist science fiction.
Also kills a lot of people, but very cozy.
Yeah.
In its way.
But there's a happy ending. That's one way to think about it. There's a happy ending.
Yeah.
It's good.
One quote that's been going through my mind the last couple of days is Ursula K. Le Guin in one of her books said, that which cannot be healed must be transcended, which is just an amazing sentence. And I kind of think of escapism as transcending. Like, it's escapism. Like the problems, some issues in our society, I don't think they can be healed, and they must be transcended. And I think sci-fi can certainly be escapism, and that escapism sometimes is transcending the issues into something new, and that's one of the reasons I love sci-fi.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Any final comments? Anything you wanted to bring up you haven't shared yet?
Science fiction is cool. Read more of it.
Hey, it's good. That needs to be put on a t-shirt. Love it. All right. Well, with that being said, I think we should go ahead and get to our last question, which is I would love for you all to share a little bit about what you're currently working on and how people can find it, or at least keep up with you so they can find it when it releases, or just anything else you want to share. So why don't we start with, we'll go in reverse order this time. So we'll start with Malka and work our way back to Sue.
Sure. So the next book in the Muslim Platy series, which is the third one, The Potency of Ungovernable Impulses, comes out in June. And I already mentioned the anthology, but I think I forgot to mention the title of it. It's called We Will Rise Again, and it'll be out from Saga in December. And if you're looking for news from around the world, you can visit my day job site, which is Global Voices.
Love it. Can people find you? Like, do you have a newsletter? Do you have social? How do people
My
find you?
newsletter languishes. I am largely on Blue Sky. I tried to cross-post to Mastodon. I tried to find photos for Instagram, but I'm debating that now. So mostly I'm on Blue Sky, and I am also extremely Googleable.
Okay. What's your Blue Sky handle?
Older.
Okay. Awesome. All right. Mary Robinette.
So I have a novel coming out March 18th, The Martian Contingency. It is all Mars all the time. And basically we land the second expedition, and there are signs that something happened during the first expedition that no one talked about. So please pre-order it. If you're interested, there's a book club read-along that is happening through my Lady Astronaut Club. It's a Discord and also Instagram. So you can read along, and then we'll be doing Q&As with me, and there's questions. So if you want to catch up with the series, the best way to follow me is just to go to my website, maryrobinettekowal.com. You can sign up for my newsletter. It links to all of the other things. You can follow my cat on Instagram at Elsie Wants.
Love that.
Yeah, she is.
Maybe I've seen your stuff. I didn't even realize it was you, because I do see lots of cat and dog talking videos.
Yeah. Yeah. So my cat, I mean, I have social media too, but let's be clear, my cat is more interesting than I am. And I know that and understand it.
Love it. That's awesome. All right, Wick.
I have a book coming out in May. It's called Dark Prophet, and it's the sequel in my Dark Law series. The first book was Dark Theory, which was a finalist in one of the SPSF-C, I think, last year. So that's coming out in May. I have a website. I actively don't want people to go to it because I don't upkeep it. So I need to work on that. Blue Sky, Wick, Welker. And then I have a medical podcast called ICU Doc Talk, which I talk about medical stuff and books and my books sometimes. So people can go to that if you were interested in medical stuff. Yeah, that's it.
Awesome. And Mary Robinette, I believe someone earlier in this panel mentioned you are also part of a podcast?
Oh, yeah, I do right. Yes, I do a podcast called Writing Excuses. We are in season 20 right now.
Okay.
Yeah, I know. But that's writingexcuses.com. And then all of your favorite streaming platforms.
Cool. That's awesome. All right, Sue.
Okay. Well, my last book came out in fall, which is Usurpation, which is right here. And it is the third book in the Semiosis trilogy. The intelligent plants come to Earth and they solve all our problems.
I'm sure that goes well for everyone.
There's a process. It was tricky.
Love it.
I also do translations. Just this month, a book called Chlorophilia by Cristina Jurado came out from Apex Books, and it's about a boy turning into a tree. And then I translated The Coffee Machine for Clark's World. I have another story, I think probably next month comes out. That's also a translation on Clark's World. And it is called Body Hoppers.
Love it.
And I have a website that I do keep up. And it is named Sue. It's at sueburke.site. And can also connect you up to other social stuff.
Awesome. Is there any particular social site you're more active on than others?
No.
Okay.
Maybe Facebook, because I post lots of silly pictures.
Love it. Love it. Okay, well, that's awesome. Thank you, everyone. And also, just for the people watching, we actually have on our TBRCon 2025 landing page on the FanFiAddict site, which is just fanfiaddict.com/TBRCon 2025. We have something that's new this year. I'm calling it the Panelist Bookstore, and I've tried to link everybody, at least a book from every author on there. If you want to go check that out, from not every author participating this year, not every author. That would be a lot of books, but yeah. So you can go find some of their books there if you want to go see that. But anyway, thank you everyone again. This was a really great conversation, and I just want to thank y'all for coming and participating. So we will call that the end. So bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
Bye.
so much. Appreciate it.